Good evening, I'm Maciej Mikos and you're watching World News Tonight. On Sunday, Moldovans cast their votes in the second round of presidential election with incumbent pro-Western Maia Sandu facing off Russian-backed candidate Alexander Stoianoglo. Will the country follow a path to the EU or will it become a Russian satellite? Well, more on that in a moment, but first let's take a look at tonight's headlines. Another death of political prisoner and a wave of mass arrests in Belarus as Lukashenko's regime continues a crackdown on opposition. Ukraine prepares for the cold season with gas supplies to last for the entire winter. And the race is almost over. Only 2 days are left to the US presidential election. Moldovan officials say Russia tried to steal the presidential elections in the country. The race was marked by reports of widespread vote buying and vote intimidation. According to incumbent president Maia Sandu, the Russians tried to buy some 300,000 votes in Moldova.
Moldovan voters were reportedly flown in from Russia free of charge to cast their ballots in the presidential runoff. The government accuses Russia of meddling in the elections, saying that the Kremlin has spent around $100 million to swing the result of the vote.
They are trying and they are attempting to undermine the democratic vote through buying more than 300,000 votes.
Are they successful in these attempts to destabilize Moldova?
For the last exercise, they were not successful.
By the narrowest of margins, Moldovans voted 2 weeks ago to make EU membership a constitutional goal. The two candidates who made it to the runoff are pro-European incumbent Maia Sandu and Alexander Stoianoglo, former prosecutor general criticized by his political opponents for being pro-Russian.
I have no relations with the Kremlin, nor with representatives of other states, nor with special services.
The thieves want to buy our vote. The thieves want to buy our country. But the power of the people is infinitely greater than any of their foul play.
In the capital city of Chisinau and surrounding areas, Sandu won decisively in the first round.
I voted for a good future for my country.
Most of the young people from Republic of Moldova is European thinking.
We are a little bit nervous because we are waiting.
Voters abroad also strongly favored the pro-European candidate 2 weeks ago. This time around, interest in voting outside Moldova seemed to be high as well. Long lines of voters queued outside the Moldovan embassy in Moscow. Singing and dancing with Moldovan and Russian flags, many of those who showed up here feel nostalgic for the Soviet times, when Russia and Moldova were one.
I want Moldova to flourish like 40, 50 years ago. We had everything. Apples, grapes, cherries. My God, everything was blooming. Now, there is nothing.
Chisinau has officially been a candidate to join the EU since 2022, but some of its residents feel like they are left behind financially.
The bigger challenge, the bigger risk for Maia Sandu is the socio-economic situation. The fact that Moldova, although its economy has seen significant gains in recent years, the economy still isn't where it should be, and people are still not feeling the benefits, people on the street. And I think that's a bigger challenge for her than interference from abroad.
Moldova is Europe's poorest nation according to economic indexes.
Polling stations have already closed across Moldova, where a presidential runoff took place today. Residents of the Eastern European country chose between a pro-EU incumbent president and a Russia-friendly former prosecutor general. And our correspondent, Marek Steele, is in Chisinau, the capital of Moldova. Good evening, Marek. So, apart from the fact that the next president's name would start with the letter S, do we know anything more? Have we got the results in yet?
Good evening, Maciej. Well, we are standing at the campaign headquarters of Maia Sandu, so the incumbent pro-EU president. We're waiting for her to come out to the press and give a short statement, but we do not know the results yet. We are still waiting for the first partial results of this election, but they may not be this accurate this evening because the pace of the counting of votes is different in Moldova, it's different abroad. 2 weeks ago, when the first round of the election took place along an EU referendum, in the evening it seems that the anti-EU camp won in the referendum. In the morning it turned out that Moldovans voted for adding EU membership to their constitution. So what we know so far, polling stations have just closed, so just at 9 p.m. Moldovan time. Turnout is over 54%. Nearly 1,700,000 Moldovans have taken part in the vote, but votes are still being counted, so the turnout may still increase. There's a record turnout also among the diaspora abroad, so 300,000, a record number of people voted abroad. There's reports of lots of foreign interference in this election. That was true 2 weeks ago, and it is true now. Stanislav Sekrieru, the national security advisor to President Sandu, wrote today on X, "We're seeing massive interference by Russia in our electoral process as Moldovans vote in the presidential runoff today, an effort with high potential to distort the outcome." There were many instances of such interference. These included bomb threats, of course, in Western European cities and polling stations there. And we've seen also huge lines in countries like Russia, Belarus, Azerbaijan, where Moldovans were reportedly being bused to polling stations and given even bonuses. So we're still waiting for the official results of this election, that the election runoff between Maia Sandu, the pro-European candidate, and Alexander Stoianoglo, supported by the Party of Socialists and often referred to as pro-Russian. So sometime early this morning we should finally know the winner of this presidential runoff in this Eastern European country. Back to you.
That was Marek Steele reporting from the capital of Moldova, Chisinau. We still don't know the results of the second round of the presidential election. Thank you so much, Marek. We'll also talk about the elections in Moldova in our interview right after the news. A 22-year-old political prisoner has died in a Belarusian prison, becoming yet another victim of the oppressive regime. The news came after Lukashenko's forces conducted another wave of mass arrests across the country. According to the human rights group Viasna, at least 7 people have lost their lives in the Belarusian jails since 2021. Kazimierz Wysiak has this next report.
22-year-old Dmitry Śledgauer died in a Belarusian prison on October 11th, but the news of his death came out only this week. He had been sentenced to 12 years in prison for alleged espionage and extremist activities, which means he dared to oppose the regime.
Most extremist act in Belarus is to vote against Lukashenko, and this is almost enough to be put on this list and to be accused of committing severe crimes.
Human rights group Viasna, which documents the repressions of the Belarusian regime, says that the number of political prisoners who have died behind bars since 2021 is now estimated at 7. The group also points out that 1,300 people are still imprisoned due to political reasons, and that number is only rising, according to Paweł Latuszka, former Belarusian ambassador to Poland.
In the last 2 days, the Lukashenko regime conducted mass arrests across the country in such places as Mogilev, Yalizawa, Minsk, Brest and many others. The police are conducting searches and arrests everywhere.
Belarus has become one of the harshest totalitarian regimes in the world since the 2020 presidential election, deemed rigged by international observers and domestic opposition groups. The Belarusian society is kept in place by this man, self-proclaimed President Alexander Lukashenko. But for experts and politicians alike, it's clear that Moscow is pulling the strings.
most people who are in prison right now, they are not only against Lukashenko, but they are potential danger to Russia.
Since 2021, the Belarusian regime has been sending waves of migrants to the borders of Poland, Lithuania and Latvia to destabilize the EU. A year later, Russian troops crossed into Ukraine from Belarus, opening up a second front in the first days of the war. The crackdown on dissent in Belarus could become even worse in the coming weeks, as the next presidential election is planned for January 2025.
Ukrainian authorities have announced they have enough natural gas reserves for the entire winter heating season. Securing enough energy during the colder months is a major issue, as intensifying Russian strikes are degrading Ukraine's power infrastructure.
Following relatively calm summer months, Russian long-range strikes against Ukraine have intensified once again. Over the past week, Ukrainian air defense has counted nearly 500 Shahed attack drones and over 900 glide bombs launched against the country. The attacks have resulted in a rise in casualties.
In October, more than 2,000 Shaheds were launched against Ukraine, against our people. Strikes took place every single day. This number of Shaheds means that more than 170,000 components that should have been blocked from being supplied to Russia have been used.
The two previous winters of the war brought intensified missile strikes. These primarily targeted Ukrainian power plants and substations distributing electricity. As a result, the country's power-generating infrastructure has been severely degraded. Civilian targets are often struck in these attacks as well. Many Russian missiles have poor guidance systems, often missing their targets and striking nearby areas. For example, S-300 anti-aircraft missiles are used against ground targets, a task for which they are completely inadequate.
Russians launched 2 ballistic missiles towards the city. 2 residential buildings have been seriously damaged. They are practically destroyed. As far as the type of the missile is concerned, they used S-300 and S-400 ballistic missiles, or Iskander-M. This is being investigated now.
Ukraine's state-run energy company announced on Sunday that it had managed to secure sufficient natural gas reserves for the winter. This was accomplished entirely by increasing domestic extraction of the fossil fuel, making Ukraine independent of foreign imports. As Russian strikes took coal fuel plants offline, the use of natural gas in Ukraine's energy mix has increased.
And now we turn our attention to the US, where 3 of our correspondents are following closely the last events of this very long presidential campaign. And so we have Ben Lee in Washington, D.C., we have Donald in Atlanta, Georgia, and we have Aaron Damon in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Good evening, gentlemen. Let's start with Ben. So, Ben, with just 2 days until the U.S. elections, anticipation is building across the nation. A recent poll shows Kamala Harris leading in Iowa. That's traditionally a Republican state. So, Ben, can you tell us more about this surprising polling result?
All right, yes, Maciej, like you mentioned, this is a surprising result indeed, and with just 2 days to go until the election, this is seen as somewhat of a bombshell. Now, if you look at recent polling when it comes to all the swing states, you see Donald Trump slightly ahead in most of the swing states, but with this Iowa kind of polling coming out, this is going to throw a wrench into the calculations, especially giving into account that for the past election cycle in 2016, Trump had a 9-point lead, and in 2020, Trump still had an 8-point lead in this Iowa state. Now, just 4 months ago, the same pollster has given Iowa with 18 more or less to Trump. So we're looking at a 21-point swing to the direction of Kamala Harris. Now, whether this is a blip on the radar, or is this canary in a coal mine situation where it's an indication of the larger direction of the population and the vote is falling into places. Of course, remains to be seen. But in the meantime, I'm going to be reporting from Washington, D.C. and bringing you more report as more information rolls out. In the meantime, back to you in the studio.
That was Ben Lee reporting from Washington, D.C. And now we move on to Don Arlett. Now, with the U.S. elections coming up on Tuesday, Americans are gearing up for what could be a monumental change in the White House in the swing state of Georgia. 4 million people have already cast their ballots in early voting, and Georgia is considered a red state. But with both presidential candidates making appearances to make a final appeal to voters, anything is possible. As I mentioned, Don Arlett is in Atlanta, Georgia. So, Don, what are the possibilities for the state to flip blue?
Well, actually, those possibilities are definitely there. If you look at the last elections back in 2020, the margin that was carried by Joe Biden was only 12,000 votes, so it was very, very close. And if you look at the midterm elections, of course, Senator Warnock, the Democrat here, overcoming Herschel Walker, the Republican candidate. So if we look at the track record, the trend is definitely there. Kamala Harris was here yesterday in Atlanta. She was definitely appealing to voters to go out and support them. Now, Trump is going to be in Macon, Georgia this evening. He will also be making a final push to garner as much support as he can, but it really is going to be the toss of a coin here in Georgia, although it's generally assumed that it will be a red state and Trump will carry it. I'd say that it's going to be very, very close, and it's going to be something we're definitely going to keep our eyes on. Another thing that might impact the Trump campaign is just a political dispute with the state's governor, Brian Kemp. Those two not getting along very well, and this could impact the prominent Republicans here in the state and their support for Donald Trump. So this is definitely a key state where we will be keeping a close eye on. Now back to you.
That was Don Arlett reporting from Atlanta, Georgia, so a close race in Georgia as well. Now, thank you so much, Don. Pennsylvania is also gearing up as a crucial bellwether in Tuesday's vote, with both candidates spending time in the swing state. Now, our chief political correspondent, Aaron Demon, is there and joins us now. So, hello, Aaron. What's the current situation in Pennsylvania, and how likely is it to change in this very last stretch of the race?
Good evening. Well, 49% to 49%. That's the situation we're looking at with Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. This is another battleground state, and it's all within the margins of error. A few weeks ago, the New York Times put out a story that was headlined, "Could Polish Americans swing this election?" 800,000 Polish Americans are right here in Pennsylvania, and it's worth remembering at this point that all the way back in 2020, Joe Biden won this state by just 1 percentage point. That's 80,000 votes. So tomorrow, both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris will be right here in Pennsylvania to make their case. Donald Trump has already been out and about in this state, and tomorrow night Kamala Harris hosts her final rally of the entire election campaign in the heart of Philadelphia. There's expected to be a concert. Roads have been closed for days. Then on Tuesday night, election night. But of course, before then, 48 hours is a long time in politics.
That was Aaron Demon reporting from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And so we have with us Ben Lee, Don Arlett and Aaron Demon, all reporting on the last days of the presidential campaign in the US. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Now, cleanup efforts are underway in Spain's east and the south after flash floods killed over 200 people. The question on how the waters could rise so rapidly to cause such a high death toll is on everybody's mind. Michael van Blomstein has more.
Public anger aimed at Spanish King Felipe VI during a visit to the region hardest hit by last week's flash floods. And the Queen was pelted with mud. Victims blamed the devastation and death toll on the slow response from rescue services.
From the authorities? No one. Do you know what it's like when no one comes to see if we need anything? Others come on foot to help me and my neighbors.
Last week's rainfall broke records that had stood for at least 75 years. At one point, a local weather station in Chiva measured more rainfall in 8 hours than the region normally receives in an entire year. More rain is expected for the coming days, even though the worst has passed. As devastating as the floods in Central and Eastern Europe were earlier this year, the weather in Spain was even more extreme.
During 8 hours, Spain got almost half a cubic meter rain per square meter. We get probably during a week the comparable amount of rain in Samaria.
Experts point to climate change as the main culprit. Warmer waters in the Mediterranean Sea make violent storms more likely. The terrain in Spain is also extra susceptible to extreme weather.
I would say that it's almost, or maybe it is unmanageable. The area of Spain is basically dry. The vegetation is very weak. It is not able to keep the rain even in lower quantities.
The waters hadn't even receded when another crisis started, one that especially hit business owners.
At 3 o'clock, people came to loot, with water still waist high. They came to loot, looting everything they could.
10,000 soldiers have been sent to the area to help with the cleanup and provide extra security. The finger-pointing has already begun. But going forward, experts say such disasters are likely to happen more often.
Well, the world follows closely the last days of the presidential campaign in the US. Another vote has taken place in a distant corner of Europe. Moldovans rushed to polling stations on Sunday, that's today, to choose their new president and determine the future of the country. And to discuss the second round of Moldovan presidential elections, we're joined by a Moldovan herself, Anastasia Pochumban, project manager at the German Council on Foreign Relations. Good evening.
Good evening.
So the polling stations have already closed, and what are your feelings before the final results are announced?
The polling stations have indeed closed in Chisinau, but not yet everywhere in Europe or in other places, so people are still actually voting. I think there are a few takeaways. First of all, we had seen a higher mobilizations also among diaspora. I myself voted in Berlin, and there was also a queue. I think it was like 45 minutes on our side. But at the same time, there were a lot of attempts to influence elections. So first of all, we have seen a lot of false bomb alerts at the embassies, as well as voter buyings and cases of people being paid. Almost there was a case of like more than 100 euros reported for people to vote against a certain candidate. The vote is against, people are encouraged to vote against Maia Sandu. And then we have seen people also, or voters being transported by buses to certain locations to vote in the elections. So I think we have seen
there were people transported by buses. There were people selling their votes, and from what I have read, for just a few euros. And Russians also, we know, they organize special flights, right? Special flights to for Moldovans living abroad to facilitate their voting. Now, you said you voted abroad, but I'm wondering how is the Moldovan diaspora voting en masse? Is it rather are there rather people voting for Stoianoglo, those backed by Russia and their planes, or rather more Moldovans living abroad would vote for Maia Sandu to continue her pro-European path?
I mean, look, it depends on the location as well, but the diaspora was the one that made the tilt and the difference in the referendum. So the diaspora overall votes more for Maia Sandu, I would say. That was also the case in the previous elections. But I think in this elections, there was also, I expect that maybe there will be a lower support comparing to the previous presidential elections. And then, of course, depending on the voting stations, in Russia, it's a higher support for Alexander Stoianoglo. We have seen also this in the first round of elections. And perhaps also people that were transported to Azerbaijan to vote in Turkey. But I would expect predominantly, I think it's up to 80% that could be voting for Maia Sandu.
Right, now let's talk about money. Maia Sandu supposedly spent around $500,000 on her presidential campaign, while, according to reports, Russia has allocated nearly $40 million to back any opposition candidate but Maia Sandu. Now, of course, that included buying votes and the plain scheme we've just talked about. Now, how effective is this Russian special operation?
I would argue it's quite effective, and I think the main proof of it is the EU referendum that happened 2 weeks ago. We have seen the referendum had passed, but at 50.35%, which is a very narrow margin. And there have been documented cases of voter bias and also organized schemes for frauding elections. There have been already quite a few interviews, or journalists have infiltrated in Shore's network, and there are proofs that the votes have been bought. So I would say Russia is playing on the existing internal grievances. So it's not just about buying the votes, it's also about further influencing polarization in the country, and especially working with people who are socially vulnerable.
Mm-hmm. Now, officially, Alexander Stoianoglo wants to somehow balance between the EU and Russia. Now, but given the fact that he has already received a Russian backing, is this even realistic scenario for Moldova?
I think he actually is an interesting candidate in the sense that he has not been actively pro-Russian, but he is supported by Dodon, the former president, who is pro-Russian, and he has officially said that he did not vote in favor of the referendum because he, for the campaign, was not organized correctly, that the referendum should have not been linked with the presidential elections. But I think this is how he gets more votes, by the fact that he is not being actively pro-Russian. He is not officially backed by Shore party, even though we have seen that Shore has advertised against voting for Maia Sandu and voting for any other candidate, which means Stoianoglo. So I think he's trying to play this game, but also the debates last week between Maia Sandu and Stoianoglo, then his arguments were not so credible. Also, especially the fact that he already has a Romanian passport, so he himself is an EU citizen, and he has not voted at the referendum. So I find this coherence is a bit maybe questionable, but at the same time, he's seen by some people as being more neutral.
Mm-hmm. Lastly, about Maia Sandu, now her reforms, pro-European reforms, are not very popular amongst Moldovans. So will she be able to keep the country on its pro-European route, path, whatever you call it, if she indeed wins the second round of the presidential election? Or should we rather expect a massive shift in the parliament, which would ultimately hamper Moldova's European ambitions?
It is indeed a very challenging period that awaits Moldova. So on the one hand, Maia Sandu has promised to make some changes in the cabinet of ministers following this presidential elections. But I think we can't expect that PAS will win a majority in the next parliamentary election. So it will be very hard a lot has to be done by the party to regain this credibility in terms of the reform processes. On the other hand, when Moldova was progressing with the EU accession, it was also on the background of the full-scale Russia's war in Ukraine that's ongoing, and the constant attacks against Moldova on the hybrid level from Russian proxies. So Moldova has also faced an economic crisis and an energy crisis. So, I mean, I think that really overstretched the resources that exist in Moldova to be able to meaningfully pursue this European integration. I mean, the enlargement reports have just been published this week, and overall, Moldova's progress is recognized, but I think this administrative capacity remains a big challenge to tackle in the next period.
Anastasia Pochumban, project manager and the German Council on Foreign Relations and, of course, expert on Moldova, was our guest this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. That is all for now, and stay with us for much more here on TVP World.